welcome to a short and sweet overview of my upcoming course on Chessable 1e6 against everything. Now, I have had courses in the past on Chessable, Master the French Defense, as well as the Aggressive Queen's Gambit Decline. This could be considered a major expansion to both courses, but I've taken notes and looked across the complaints that Chessable users have, and this course was made for my students, the beginner/intermediate players, and I wanted to check every box. We've got simplified variations without taking away theoretical validity. We've got deeply annotated example games, and we've got tactics that stem from our trainables pulled from actual games, not constructed positions. So let's dive right into some of the theory and see what I'm talking about here. And in this first video, we're going to look at the French defense with e4, e6. The following video, we're going to take a look at the 3h6 Queen's Gambit, bit new, the Sarin Queen's Gambit, and then finally we're going to come full circle to see, as a bonus, how we can use ideas and structural orientation from these first two videos to have a complete repertoire playing with white as well. So without further ado, let's get right in with the French defense. And of the big four against the king pawn, we've got the symmetrical king pawn, the Sicilian, the Caro-Kann, and the French. The French is by far the easiest to learn, and you can focus on learning fundamentals while going through the opening, which is why it has been a cornerstone of my teaching when working with my students since I began as a full-time teacher teaching chess, roughly a decade ago now. So, without any more delay, let's start with the exchange variation. And this is typically the variation that turn a lot of people off of the French. But if you can understand how to create imbalances from this position, you'll be quite comfortable as black. Let's think in terms of judo here. And no matter what, we do not want a mirror image. It's very easy to get equality with black. We want to press for the win. So after e takes d5, first and foremost, let's go with bishop d3. So you have to ask the question when playing against the exchange French, how can I create an imbalance in this position? And in this case, I can immediately play the move knight c6 to hone in on the d4 pawn. Where an imbalance is going to be created is white is typically going to play c3, to shore up the pawn chain. And if they play a move like knight f3, well, we have bishop g4 to renew the threat. And if knight e2, we have knight b4 to go after the better bishop in the position. So without going further, I really want to highlight that good bishop versus bad bishop situation. So in this case, most players would look at the position and go, well, both bishops can get out easily. There's not a bad bishop. No. Understand the definition of good bishop and bad bishop. It has to do with the center pawn that is stuck. If your pawn is stuck in the center, it indicates which bishop is bad. What I want you to think about is if I remove all of the highlighted pieces, we're left both with light square bishops. In every endgame, our bishop is only going to be able to defend that pawn that's stuck in the center. Our opponent's bishop, on the other hand, is going to be able to attack that pawn that's stuck. And just like boxing, chess has that overlap of the aggressor is going to win. You cannot win by pure defense. So that's going to be an endgame that's going to be suffering for black. So in the majority of lines, with our structure, e6 and d5, we're defining the bad bishop, and it's typically going to be that c8 bishop. And I want you to see how we're making the proper trade across the variations, looking always to get rid of our bad bishop for its strong counterpart and avoid the trade oppositely of our good bishop for its counterpart. There will be extenuating circumstances from time to time where we're trading advantages, but I'll make that clear, of course, in the main course and try to in this quick video recap. So, bishop d3, we're looking for that imbalance. Knight c6 hitting the d pawn. After c3, now it's a question of what is optimal development. Most players just casually play knight f6 here, but white's able to create a positive imbalance. This isn't ideal. Best and most flexible is bishop d6. We're taking away a key square of development from the c1 bishop, and we're staying flexible to just see what white wants in the position. So in this case, after knight f3, we have another positive imbalance, bishop g4, pinning the knight. And on castles, the most flexible move is knight g to e7. So it's bishop d6 and knight g to e7. And the main idea is we have a lot of flexibility in this position after queen d7. And after knight bd2, we castle. And then following a high-level game, bishop f5, best, to get rid of our bad bishop for its counterpart. Next, let's take a look at another variation of the exchange French, see how we can create an imbalance again against knight c3. And this seems to be a problem variation for some of my students because, well, I know I'm supposed to play bishop d6, but that will hang the d-pawn. So what do I need to do to try to get to my ideal setup? Defend the pawn, create an imbalance. Do not mirror image. That is the #1 rule when playing the exchange French. And after bishop d3, bishop d6. Again, if knight f3, pin. So much stronger is white plays knight g to e2. What is white trying to angle for here? White wants control of f4 so they can make the trade of their bad bishop for our good one. So what is a move, prophylaxis, against this plan? Queen f6. Not only are we taking away the f4 square, we're setting up the ability to trade off our bad bishop on the subsequent move. Then simple development ensues with the knights coming in, play for the win. Next up in the exchange, we've got the only variation where we're playing the early knight f6, and I have 2 example games in the course which are deeply annotated with how to play with and against the isolated pawn. I feel it's so important to understand the themes of how to play some of these old positions. So knight c3, and I'm not a big fan of the bishop b4 lines for this text, as that's our good bishop. So whenever we can, we're going to maintain the tension and keep that better piece with bishop e7. And after knight f3, we have a very key memory marker. We've gotten a solid setup so far, and we're waiting for a moment. We're waiting to capture only when white moves this bishop to either e2 or d3. Because as soon as bishop e2 is played, we're able to capture, forcing that bishop to stutter step, moving again, wasting time. Now we're going to play against this isolated pawn, knight bd7, knight b6, c6 to blockade, where we're going to stick a knight there and bishop e6. Overall goal when playing an isolated pawn position, trade the minor pieces off to make it to a heavy piece ending so you can pile up. So imagine all of the minor pieces are gone. I have a rook, queen, we've got Alekine's gun hitting the pawn, and white on the other hand has queen, rook, rook. We play c5, we end up winning the pawn and eventually the game. Next up, we've got what's widely considered the main line of the French. And you've seen so far the natural move bishop g4. And in Master of the French Defense, I did initially recommend bishop g4, but came back in expansion and I saw one of my favorite French players, Grandmaster Georg Meyer, playing this new move, bishop f5, in a lot of his Title Tuesday games. So what's wrong with bishop g4? Well, Kasparov back in the day, and in modern times, Grandmaster Fishman, He's been playing after h3, queen e2, and this is a bit of an annoying position to face as white gets this nice imbalance to play with, and black is okay, but we're playing from our back foot. We can avoid this altogether with the new theory with bishop f5, and very often what we saw in our practice games when testing this was the immediate bishop d3. And isn't that our goal, to make this trade? And here, queen b5 check is threatened, so the simple c6 takes care of that. Now, hopefully we've gotten down where our pieces go now. Optimal squares for the knight and bishop stays the same. So bishop d6, followed by knight e7. Key memory marker here, and one of the main reasons we want the knight on e7, f6. Kicks the bishop and takes full control over e5, making sure white can't use it for their knight. So I've got an example game that I personally played here, showing how we can slowly press this position with square control. So we have made it through the exchange. Now let's knock out the advanced variation. And this is one of those fundamental positions. The center is locked. You play on the wing to undermine the center. And I will say the most common mistake in my students' games under 1,000 is white not defending the center in the optimal way. White needs to play c3 here, but knight f3 is the most common mistake, where we need to capture and this pawn will be weak. For instance, if knight c6, bishop d3, one of our main goals is trading off our bad bishop. We have the wonderful idea of bishop a6 here, whereas takes, check, we get rid of the piece, and we can slowly build up on this pawn in the future with these types of ideas. So coming back, c5 to try to break the chain, and the very natural knight c6 is the #1 choice. And time and again in my books, I look for ways to cut down on what you need to know and get more point A to B thinking. So I like the more flexible move, queen b6, with the idea to go bishop d7. Why? Bad bishop, French bishop, good bishop. I want to find the right moment to play bishop b5 to trade. Once I've gotten rid of that strong bishop, I'm going to be safe on the king side, don't have to worry about being attacked, and I'm going to get for that ideal setup playing against the d4 pawn. So let's see it in motion here. After bishop e2 or bishop d3, we're going to capture in the center, and now get rid of our bad bishop. Now we're going to optimize against the d pawn. We already have one attacker, so knight c6. We're deprived of the best square for this knight, so knight e7 to f5. And things are going right when all of your pieces are attacking and all of your opponent's pieces are having to defend. Bishop e7, followed by castles. And again, I have an example game in the main course showing exactly how black can play for a win in this position. Next up, we've covered exchange and we have covered advanced. So the main thing you face as your rating goes up is going to be knight d2 and knight c3. And I recommend the Rubinstein variation as well as the classical, McCutcheon, Winnower, and 2 different variations of the Tarrasch and Master of the French. It got that course name for a reason. But for beginner and intermediate players, I want to cut down the amount of lines that you need to know to start playing immediately. So with the exchange and advance, if you want to knock out as many lines as possible, either with knight c3 or knight d2, we can take in the center and get back to that fundamental idea of get rid of our bad bishop. Bishop d7, followed by bishop c6 to trade off the bishop. And before I go on, I will mention that the two knights variation can also transpose, so we can cut out another variation you need to know by taking here and doing our bishop zigzag maneuver, which is a direct transposition into the Fort Knox variation of the Rubinstein. So coming right on back, as well, if you're looking for something more theoretical, I have alternatives in the course, which we'll see coming up for knight c3 and knight d2. But in the meantime, let's do the zigzag to get rid of our bad bishop. And it's best to start with knight d7 here. Knight f6 is a bit of a problem. For instance, takes, bishop g5, and the queen's having a bad day. So instead, knight d7 to make that landing space for our other knight. And now is a good time to take. And the thing to remember about this very solid position, white has the bishop pair. We are in a cramped position. Ideally, we want to trade bishops. You go, well, that's the good bishop. You told us not to do that. In this case, we're angling for a knight versus bishop endgame. This semi-open position. You're playing for an imbalance to play for the win. So knight d5 followed by bishop g5 is a common maneuver in this position. And if white plays a number of passive moves, we have ideas like queen b6 and place rooks on the E and D files or D and C files to eventually play a c5 break. Position is rather easy for black to play once you can reach this ideal position. So if that's a bit too solid for you, well, let's say first we'll start with knight d2 with a tirage. After writing two variations in Master of the French, I gotta say c5 is what I feel is theoretically most sound and the best option for black here. Where if white takes, I don't want to deal with isolated pawn positions unless I absolutely have to. I'm going to play queen takes. And after knight gf3 takes, bishop c4. And all queen moves on the D file are theoretical moves that have been played. But I'm following my recommendation from Master of the French Defense here because I just feel that it is absolutely the best. Is if queen d6, for instance, we're blocking the path of our bishop, which in turn will lead to this nasty variation, which I will quickly go through. White goes after the pawn. We do some trades. We need to play a6 to cover the b5 square. The rook gets lined up on our e-pawn. Give a question to the bishop. And all of a sudden, knight f5, this is a key problem move. And nearly all games from this position, roughly 400 games, end in a draw. Now, I'm not a big fan of writing a book that it's black to play and draw. So let's try to keep tension the best we can. So now that we see that queen d6 blocks in the bishop, hopefully you understand why queen d7, holding this pawn and giving the freedom of this bishop to come out, is going to be superior in my position. My opinion, rather. So, castles, knight c6, and don't worry about the French b. He's coming out to b7 soon. Knight b3, no way to keep the pawns, we're going to give it back. And now, of course, knight takes is analyzing the main course. Just a teaser trailer here. Got to worry about the b5 square being used, so a6, followed by b5 and bishop b7, and black's completely fine, and we'll finish development bringing that f8 bishop out. So this is one of the major deviations that I had from Master of the French against the nasty gambit here. I always thought we should play against these ideas. But there was a game played between two strong GMs that made me a believer that you can take here and not only get away with it, but black's on the verge of having a winning position if you play it appropriately. So by far the main move is knight h3. And Our queen is going to e7. But this stutter step move is what's going to cause white problems later. Queen h4. We're provoking g3, so rook lift ideas are going to be impossible now. So that's one finesse, theoretically, that makes a huge difference. Next is, you can't really justify the attack if my king is not on the king side. We're going to castle queen side here. So let's see it unfold. Queen g4, defend. Knight f4, bother the queen. Make sure there's no sacrifices. Knight c6. c5 is far too accommodating, as likely there's a sacrifice on d5 there. Knight b6, covering d5. Bishop d7. And there's really no way to stop us from accomplishing our goal in the position. Full example game here between two GMs. Essentially, black's pawn up. Next up, we've got the French classical. And again, I deviated from my recommendation in Master the French. I had recommended at this juncture bishop e7, which is a sideline, but upon reinvestigation with new engines and just the want to recommend something different, I came back to easily the main line in practice, a6. So let's see some of these ideas in motion. b5, followed by d takes c5. And after bishop takes c5, we'll go through multiple moves and variations, but this is the cleanest path to show a critical plan in playing the classical French. c8 bishop is always our problem bishop, so watch how we're going to fix the problem, as this is going to be, say, easily 60% of the lines is this type of maneuver. Queen b6, followed by clearing the squares for our bishop to be able to come to a6. Key idea, very straightforward. Now, how about the King's Indian attack? And we face multiple move orders in the course. You can face it from one knight f3, and we'll cover that in the second video. So after bishop e7, we're going to get an ideal setup. And the main thing I want you to keep in mind is a series of memory markers, putting our pieces on appropriate squares to make a single plan work. You have to understand what white's going for. They want to take the center and then have a big attack against our king side, where they're looking to eventually sacrifice. So we're going to play against this. First, I want my bishop on a decent square. Why play b6 when we can gain more space with b5? Now on e5, we're starting to coordinate against the pawn. They defend the pawn. All the moves so far have been relatively straightforward. This is the first memory marker that is extremely important. Black needs to shore up the king side. So first, rook f to c8. Now, this knight is going to come around, typically to h2, but I think the better attempt is knight e3. There's a nasty discovery lined up here. So, you need to be able to play queen d8. If you play another move, knight takes d5, followed by e6, this is not what we signed up for. So knight e3, memory marker, queen d8. So coming back, again, important memory marker, rook f to c8, h6, and if they went h5 earlier, we go h6. Notice how they're loading everything up. So we needed to clear the rook to c8 for this bishop to drop back. The rook needed to be on c8 so the queen can also drop back. And in the event knight d4 is played, if it trades, the rook's going to be on the open c file. Hopefully you see how everything just fits together so nicely. So on queen d2, White has loaded up everything they've got on h6. We simply go queen d8, where you will find the sacrifice simply does not work. White does not have enough in this position. And in fact, I've got an example game in the course where, without much effort, I defeated an IM from this position. Next up, and our final variation, we've got our sidelines. So if you didn't like that variation versus the two knights earlier, we've got no less than two other options in the course for you. And we've got the La Bourdonnaise variation covered with knight h6. We've got the wing gambit covered, and the easiest way to play against the wing gambit, and I repeat my line from Master of the French, b6. We've got the Steinitz variation, and I covered both lines just because it's relatively easy and it's user's choice between c takes or bishop takes. Both of them are completely fine, and you're going to get a Queen's Gambit-esque development eventually, playing b6, bishop b7, and eventually c5. And last but certainly not least, we've got the Schlechter variation where we tempo. And the main thing that you want to remember is I want to play for c5 and then eventually get a knight to e5 to bother this bishop. That's the key memory marker. So knight e5, and it's already relatively easy position to play. Last but certainly not least, I deviated from previous recommendations and played d4. And we've got really nothing to worry about here. Knight e2, c5, an important move to gain space and secure the pawn. Now after c3, this is by far the main line. Got to be careful because the natural looking knight c6 puts us in a terrible position. Knight f6 is the key move, critical. And after e5, knight fd7, where after this trade down, white's left themselves with an isolated pawn. And of course, we're happy to trade knights here and get rid of our bad bishop. So after knight takes, bishop check. Let's just bring the knight back. And this breaks the pin and gets ready to liquidate. Bishop d6, followed by the nice move, a novelty in the position, knight e7, looking again to get rid of our bad bishop. Have very easy development, and we're ready to set up a blockade against the isolated pawn. That's going to do it for video 1. Hopefully, like this overview of the French in the upcoming course, 1e6 against everything. Join us in the next video where I'm going to take a look at 1e6 being played using Sarin's Queen's Gambit against d4, knight f3, and c4.